I'll give you $10,000 for a single night as my date at a grand gala. Get ready.
No.
The black maid who said no to the billionaire CEO, now he can't stop thinking about her. Clarence Haywood was a billionaire who believed money could solve anything. With his fortune and power, people rushed to please him, terrified of losing his favor. No one had ever told him no, until Valerie Randall walked into his life. Valerie was a maid working long hours to support herself while chasing her education. She wasn't dazzled by money or promises of luxury. One evening, Clarence made her an offer, $10,000 for a single night as his date at a grand gala. For most, it would have been a dream come true. But to Clarence's shock, Valerie turned him down flat. The room froze. His assistants gasped. A maid had just rejected the untouchable Clarence Haywood. But instead of anger, something unexpected happened inside him, a burning curiosity about the woman who refused him. Who was she, and why couldn't she be bought like everyone else? What Clarence did next would shake not only his empire but also his heart. What would you do if you were in Valerie's shoes? Take the money, or stand your ground? Tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more gripping love stories, because tomorrow, I'll be dropping another one you won't want to miss. Clarence Haywood was not used to rejection. In his world, one phone call could make doors open, one offer could silence resistance, and one signature could change a person's entire life. 4 years, this was how he lived, commanding respect, or at least the illusion of it, with his money. But Valerie Randall's refusal lingered like an unsolved riddle in his mind. She hadn't just said no, she had looked him in the eye, steady and fearless, and turned down what most would have considered a golden ticket. That moment replayed in his head over and over again. Determined to prove that everyone had a price, Clarence doubled his offer the very next day. $20,000, in crisp bills, delivered in a discreet envelope. Valerie returned it without hesitation, her voice calm, almost gentle but firm. "I told you, Mr. Haywood, I'm not interested." Clarence's pride stung. He had dealt with rivals in boardrooms, lawyers in court, even politicians who tried to control him. None had ever unnerved him the way this maid did with a simple sentence. But instead of deterring him, her resistance only fueled a dangerous fascination. Days later, Valerie found a box waiting for her in the staff quarters. Inside was a gown, tailored in her size, its label worth more than her yearly salary. A handwritten note from Clarence read, "Wear this, and I'll make sure you never have to scrub another floor again." She folded the dress neatly back into the box and returned it without a word. Each attempt made Clarence more restless. He offered her a promotion, head maid, triple the pay, her own apartment. Valerie declined. He arranged for her tuition to be paid in full, thinking perhaps her education was her weakness. She sent the check back and signed. Clarence had women lined up, women who would gladly trade their freedom for a fraction of what he was offering. Yet here was Valerie, holding fast to something money couldn't touch. That made her dangerous to him, but also magnetic. For Valerie, the refusals weren't easy. She needed the money. She dreamed of finishing school, of one day stepping into a career that could free her from endless shifts and sore hands. But every time she looked at Clarence, she saw a man testing her integrity, not offering kindness. She had grown up watching her mother take handouts from men who treated her like property, and she swore she would never live that way. At night, when she lay awake, she sometimes wondered if she was making a mistake. $10,000 could have cleared her debts. $20,000 could have bought her freedom. But freedom earned at the cost of self-respect was no freedom at all. Clarence couldn't stop thinking about her. He found himself distracted in meetings, his temper short with his staff. His assistants whispered about the change in his mood. Business partners noticed his unusual silence at dinners. He wasn't used to being thrown off balance. For the first time in years, he questioned himself. Why did Valerie matter? Why couldn't he move on to one of the countless women eager for his attention? Why did this one maid with no wealth, no social standing, and no interest in his fortune have such a hold on him? One evening, Clarence decided to confront the mystery head-on. He dismissed the staff and waited by the service entrance, where Valerie usually arrived for her shift. When she stepped through the door, exhausted but composed, he blocked her path. "Why do you keep refusing me?" he asked, his voice low but urgent. Valerie met his gaze without fear. "Because I know what men like you want," she replied. "And I won't sell myself. Not for 10,000, not for 20, not for 100. Her words hit him harder than any boardroom defeat. He stood frozen as she brushed past him, leaving him in the silence of his own thoughts. Clarence's obsession deepened. This was no longer about a date, or pride, or money. It was about control, and the unsettling realization that Valerie had stripped him of it. She was the one person in his world who couldn't be swayed, and that terrified him. Yet somewhere within that fear grew something unexpected: admiration. But Valerie's next refusal wouldn't just bruise Clarence's ego, it would wound his heart in ways he never expected. Clarence was not a man who tolerated defiance. He had tolerated Valerie's refusals longer than he should have, but his patience had limits. That night, instead of sending gifts or money, he sent an order. Valerie was summoned to his penthouse, a place most staff never set foot in. She hesitated but went, unwilling to risk her job. The elevator ride felt endless. When the doors opened, she stepped into a space of gleaming marble and glass, a world far removed from her modest reality. Clarence stood at the window, his hands in his pockets, watching the city lights flicker below. "You keep refusing me," he said without turning. His voice was calm, but beneath it was steel. "Why?" Valerie drew a steady breath. "Because what you're asking for isn't respect. It's ownership. And I'm not for sale." Her words sliced through the air, sharper than anything he had ever heard in a boardroom. Clarence turned, his eyes searching her face, trying to make sense of the defiance. No one spoke to him like this. No one ever dared. "You think I'm trying to own you?" he asked, his tone edged with disbelief. "Do you have any idea how many women would kill for the chance I'm giving you?" Valerie's gaze didn't waver. "Then give it to them. But not me. I'd rather scrub these floors for the rest of my life than lose myself for one night with you." Clarence flinched as if struck. In that moment, she wasn't just rejecting his money, she was rejecting the very foundation of who he was. For years, his wealth had been the measure of his worth. But Valerie looked at him as if none of it mattered. The silence stretched between them, charged with something neither could name. Anger, yes. Frustration. But under it all, an energy that felt dangerously close to attraction. "You don't even know me," Clarence muttered. "You see a billionaire and assume I'm just a man who buys what he wants." Valerie crossed her arms, standing her ground. "I see a man who's never heard the word no. Maybe it's time you did." Her voice was steady, but her heart was racing. Standing alone in his penthouse, face to face with the most powerful man in the city, she knew this could cost her everything. Yet she refused to back down. Clarence stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. For the first time, Valerie felt the weight of his intensity, not just his money or his power, but the man beneath it. His eyes locked onto hers, not with the arrogance of a conqueror, but with the hunger of someone desperate to be understood. "Why do you hate me so much?" he asked, his voice softer now. "I don't hate you," Valerie replied quietly. "I just refuse to let you define my worth. If I said yes, I'd be betraying myself. And I won't." The honesty in her tone left Clarence speechless. No one had ever told him the truth so plainly. No one had ever held up a mirror to the emptiness he carried inside. He should have been furious. Instead, he felt something he couldn't name, a crack in the armor he had built his entire life upon. Valerie's refusal wasn't just a rejection. It was a challenge, one he didn't know if he could meet. The air between them shifted. Their anger had softened into something else, something neither of them wanted to admit. Valerie felt it too, the strange pull of two worlds colliding, resisting and yet drawn toward each other. Clarence exhaled, his jaw tight. "You're either the bravest woman I've ever met, or the most foolish." "Maybe both," she answered. For a long moment, They stood in silence, their eyes locked, neither willing to step back. The city stretched endlessly beyond the glass, but in that room, the battle was personal, raw, and intimate. Clarence thought he had summoned her to remind her of his power. Instead, she had stripped it from him without lifting a finger. For the first time in his life, Clarence Haywood felt exposed, seen not as a billionaire, but as a man who might have nothing if money were taken away. What Valerie didn't realize was that this confrontation was only the beginning. Clarence thought he had all the power. But after this night, he would come to realize Valerie might be the only person who could destroy him, or save him. Clarence had always measured success by the length of contracts and the number of digits on his balance sheet. But after that confrontation in the penthouse, the silence that lingered long after Valerie walked out struck him harder than any business loss ever had. Her words, blunt and unwavering, echoed in his mind like an unwanted refrain. "I'm not for sale. My dignity isn't a price tag." For the first time in his adult life, he felt something cracking inside him, not weakness, but recognition. Recognition that perhaps she was right. His wealth had built empires, toppled rivals, and bought him loyalty, but none of it filled the hollowness Valerie had uncovered with just a few words. The following weeks brought changes, small at first, almost imperceptible to those around him. Clarence began reviewing contracts he'd signed in haste, questioning deals that profited him at the expense of countless workers. He canceled a project that would have stripped a struggling neighborhood of its homes, redirecting those funds toward affordable housing. When questioned by his board, he brushed off their concerns with the same calm authority that once silenced dissent. But inside, he knew these were seeds planted by Valerie's stubborn refusal to bend. Valerie, however, remained cautious. She noticed the whispers in the hotel corridors. The billionaire who once flaunted his extravagance was showing up at charity galas without cameras. She watched discreetly when he funded a scholarship program for underprivileged youths, the kind of opportunity she herself had once longed for but never received. Yet every time Clarence's gaze lingered on her, waiting for acknowledgement, Valerie turned away. Trust, for her, was not something earned overnight. She had grown up watching her mother labor day and night for pennies, rejecting men who thought they could buy her affection with handouts. Valerie had inherited that same steel spine. No matter how grand Clarence's gestures were, she couldn't let herself be swayed by surface-level change. Still, one night, as she left her shift, she saw him standing by his car. No entourage. No chauffeur. Just him, holding a takeout container. He extended it toward her. "You skipped dinner again," he said, his voice lacking its usual command. "I thought you might be hungry." Valerie hesitated. It was a simple gesture, so simple it disarmed her. Against her better judgment, she accepted the container. Their hands brushed, and in that fleeting touch, something stirred. It wasn't surrender, but it wasn't rejection either. That night, Valerie ate alone in her small apartment, staring at the food he had brought. It wasn't expensive, not plated from a five-star restaurant. It was a modest dish from a local diner she once mentioned in passing. For the first time, she wondered, could Clarence really be trying? But just as her defenses began to lower, Clarence's world, already fragile from the changes he was making, was about to be shaken by a betrayal that would cut deeper than any business rivalry. Clarence had built his empire on loyalty, or so he believed. Yet as he began shifting his priorities, cracks started forming in places he hadn't expected. His board of directors noticed the changes first. They whispered in private meetings, questioning his sudden interest in philanthropy, accusing him of going soft. For years, they admired his ruthlessness, his ability to turn profit even in impossible markets. Now those same men and women eyed him with thinly veiled suspicion, as though kindness was a disease that would infect the entire company. Clarence ignored their murmurs, but he could feel the tension growing. What startled him more was how much Valerie's presence, or absence, determined his resolve. On days she avoided him, he felt the weight of his empire pressing down harder than usual. On days she offered even a hint of acknowledgement, like a fleeting smile or a simple nod, his chest felt lighter. He had never been so vulnerable to another human being, and that frightened him more than any hostile takeover ever could. One evening, Clarence attended a fundraiser quietly, without his usual fanfare. The event raised money for children battling illnesses, and he donated anonymously, slipping out before anyone could notice. But as he turned to leave, he caught Valerie across the room, volunteering at the check-in desk. She didn't know he had seen her, but the way she laughed with the children, the gentleness in her movements, it struck him harder than any lecture or rejection ever had. The next morning, he canceled 2 deals that had been in negotiation for months, deals that would have made him billions but at the expense of small communities. His advisors erupted in outrage, warning him of financial fallout. Clarence listened silently, then dismissed them all with a single wave of his hand. Their discontent didn't matter anymore. What mattered was becoming a man Valerie could respect, not fear. Valerie noticed these changes, though she tried to remain detached. Late at night, when she finally allowed herself moments of honesty, she admitted he was no longer the man she once despised. But doubt lingered like a shadow. Was this truly him, or just another calculated strategy to win her? She couldn't afford to fall for an illusion, not when her heart had already endured enough betrayals in the past. Still, small moments began to break through her guarded walls. One rainy afternoon, Clarence appeared in the staff break room, not in his tailored suits, but in a plain shirt with sleeves rolled up, helping a maintenance worker fix a leaky faucet. Valerie froze, watching as the billionaire knelt on the floor, getting his hands dirty without hesitation. The staff exchanged astonished glances, but Clarence didn't seem to care. When his eyes finally lifted and caught hers, something unspoken passed between them. For the first time, Valerie didn't look away. That evening, Clarence found himself admitting something he had never said aloud, even to himself. This wasn't conquest. This wasn't about bending her to his will or proving that his wealth could buy anything. This was love. It terrified him. It exhilarated him. It made him question everything he thought he knew about power. But just as the fragile thread of trust between them began to strengthen, shadows loomed from within Clarence's own circle. One of his most trusted executives, resentful of his new direction, had been quietly scheming. Documents were being forged, alliances formed in secret. Clarence's empire was about to be shaken by betrayal, not from rivals outside his empire, but from those he thought stood firmly at his side. And this betrayal wouldn't just threaten his fortune. It would threaten the very bond that had just begun to bloom between him and Valerie. The storm came faster than Clarence expected. One morning, while reviewing his company's financials, he noticed discrepancies, small at first, buried under layers of paperwork. But Clarence's instincts, sharpened by years of ruthless business, caught it immediately. Millions had been siphoned off into offshore accounts. The culprit wasn't a competitor. It was one of his closest executives, a man he had once trusted like family. Clarence confronted the betrayal quietly at first, demanding answers in private. But the executive didn't flinch. Instead, he smirked, throwing Valerie's name into the fire. Ever since you started playing house with that maid, you've gone soft. You've become a liability. The board is ready to cut you out before you ruin everything. Those words cut deeper than the theft itself. Clarence had been prepared for financial treachery. What he wasn't prepared for was his obsession with Valerie being turned into ammunition against him. Later that evening, he found Valerie in the quiet corner of the estate, folding linens with her usual precision. He wanted to tell her everything, the betrayal, the looming threats, the board's whispers. But when she looked up at him with cautious eyes, the words faltered. Instead, he asked softly, "Do you ever think I'm changing for the wrong reasons?" Valerie paused, studying him carefully. She had seen glimpses of sincerity in his recent actions, but doubt still gnawed at her. "Only you can answer that, Clarence. If you're changing just to win me, it won't last. But if you're changing because you've discovered who you truly want to be, then maybe it will." Her words struck him harder than any corporate betrayal could. The next day, the board launched their strike. Leaks hit the media, claims that Clarence had abandoned profitable ventures, accusations that he was funneling company money into worthless charities. His reputation began to splinter under the weight of scandal. Investors threatened to pull out. For the first time in his career, Clarence Haywood looked like he could fall. Valerie watched from the sidelines, torn. She hadn't asked him to sacrifice his empire, yet here he was, standing against his own board, reshaping his empire with morality instead of greed. And now, the world was punishing him for it. But the betrayal didn't stop at the company. One night, Clarence returned to his penthouse to find documents scattered across his desk, papers Valerie had never seen before. Contracts that painted her as a manipulator, a gold digger, someone who had seduced the billionaire into losing his edge. The betrayal had turned personal. Valerie's chest tightened as Clarence picked up the forged papers. His eyes burned with fury, but not at her. At those who dared to weaponize her name to destroy him. For the first time, Clarence wasn't just defending his fortune. He was defending her. Yet the damage was spreading fast. Media outlets latched onto the scandal, calling her the maid who ruined the billionaire. Strangers online tore her apart, mocking her background, questioning her motives. Valerie's world, already fragile, shook under the weight of cruel headlines. In those moments, Clarence's empire and Valerie's dignity collided in the most brutal way. She had fought so hard to prove she wasn't for sale, but now she was being painted as the very thing she despised. Standing in the wreckage of his penthouse office, Clarence made a silent vow. He could lose the company. He could lose the fortune. But he could not, would not, lose Valerie. What he didn't know was that the betrayal was far deeper than forged contracts and stolen millions. Someone close was preparing to strike at Valerie directly, in a way that would test Clarence's promise, and Valerie's ability to trust him, like never before. The betrayal finally reached Valerie in the cruelest way. One evening, she was leaving the estate after a long shift when a group of reporters cornered her at the gates. Microphones thrust in her face, cameras flashing, voices firing questions like bullets. Are you really the maid who trapped Clarence Haywood? Did you use him to climb out of poverty? Did you threaten to expose his secrets if he didn't keep you around? Valerie froze, her hands trembling as strangers shouted lies she had never imagined hearing about herself. Their words weren't questions, they were accusations. In their eyes, she wasn't a hard-working woman with dreams. She was a scandal, a parasite leeching off a billionaire. By the time she escaped the chaos and reached her small apartment, tears burned her face. The humiliation was unbearable. She had done nothing but hold on to her dignity, yet the world had twisted it into something ugly. For the first time, she wondered if saying no to Clarence had cursed her life. Meanwhile, Clarence was in his penthouse, raging at the board members who had leaked the smear campaign. He slammed his fist against the table, demanding names, demanding accountability. But all he received was silence. The betrayal had roots deeper than he thought, and Valerie was now bleeding from its thorns. When he finally found her hours later, curled on her couch with a television still replaying her name in scandal, he saw a side of Valerie he had never seen before. She looked defeated. I told you, she whispered through shaky breaths. Our worlds don't fit. I don't belong in your story, Clarence. They'll never see me as anything more than a maid who ruined you. Her words stabbed at him harder than the betrayal itself. For the first time in his life, Clarence had no quick solution, no amount of money or power that could erase what she had endured. He sat beside her, his voice softer than it had ever been. You're wrong, Valerie. You're not ruining me. You're saving me. I didn't know who I was until you stood in front of me and told me no. And now, I'd rather lose everything than lose you. She turned to him, tears streaking her face, searching his eyes for sincerity. Part of her wanted desperately to believe him. Part of her was terrified he was saying what she longed to hear, only to let her fall later. For a brief, fragile moment, she allowed herself to rest her head against his shoulder. The silence between them carried more weight than words. But peace didn't last. That very night, Clarence's phone lit up with a call that shattered what little stability they had found. The voice on the other end was cold, deliberate. If you don't cut ties with her, Clarence, The board won't just take your company. They'll drag her name so far into the dirt she'll never recover. This is your final warning. Clarence tightened his grip on the phone, fury boiling inside him. But when he glanced at Valerie sleeping lightly beside him, he realized the threat wasn't empty. They were ready to destroy her completely. The choice before him was clearer than ever, and far more dangerous. Protect his empire, or protect the woman who had already cost him everything he thought mattered. For Clarence Haywood, the billionaire who once believed money could buy anything, this was the one decision he couldn't put a price on. Clarence could no longer deny it. This wasn't about pride, or a game of power, or proving he could have what no one else could. Somewhere between Valerie's refusals and her fierce honesty, something had shifted inside him. This was no longer conquest, it was love. But admitting that, even to himself, felt dangerous. Love had never been part of his world. Deals, contracts, profits, those were safe. Love was unpredictable, messy, uncontrollable. And yet, every time Valerie's eyes locked with his, every time her voice cut through his arrogance, Clarence knew he was in uncharted territory. Valerie, too, found herself caught in a storm of emotions. She couldn't deny the way her heart skipped when Clarence softened around her, when his gestures carried sincerity instead of arrogance. She had seen glimpses of a man who wanted to be better. But fear lingered. What if it was all an act? What if, once he conquered her heart, he tossed it aside like another acquisition? She had spent her life guarding her dignity. To give her heart to Clarence Haywood could mean losing everything she stood for. Outside their fragile bond, society was sharpening its knives. Gossip columns branded Clarence as reckless, claiming he was lowering himself for a maid. The whispers spread beyond tabloids, seeping into boardrooms, galas, and private circles. The billionaire who traded power for a servant. The CEO destroying his legacy over a cleaning girl. The backlash wasn't just talk. Valerie felt it in the stares from strangers, in the judgmental glances of guests at events where she served. Some mocked her openly, others whispered loud enough for her to hear. She pretended their words didn't hurt, but inside, she questioned whether her presence in Clarence's life was slowly destroying them both. One night, after another brutal article painted her as Clarence's downfall, Valerie confronted him. "Why are you doing this? Why put everything on the line for me?" Clarence stepped closer, his voice steady but his eyes raw with vulnerability. "Because for the first time, Valerie, I care about something more than money. More than my empire. I care about you. And if I lose everything because of that, then maybe I never really had anything worth keeping." Her breath caught in her throat. The sincerity in his tone shattered the last pieces of her defenses. But just as her guard began to lower, fear clawed its way back in. Could love between a billionaire and a maid survive the weight of an empire? Could their worlds ever align without breaking them both? She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe in them. But the risks felt unbearable. Clarence, however, had already made up his mind. He knew what he wanted. And he was about to make the boldest decision of his life, one that could cost him his empire, but might finally prove to Valerie that his love was real. The backlash escalated. Clarence's board members, once silent, now moved openly against him. Shareholders demanded answers. His leadership was questioned in headlines across the globe. Every business network carried the same story: Clarence Haywood risks empire for Maid. At first, Clarence tried to fight back with his usual weapons: press statements, financial reassurances, promises of future profits. But the more he defended, the louder the whispers grew. The truth was clear: they didn't doubt his business sense. They doubted him. Valerie bore the weight of it too. One afternoon, she returned from the grocery store to find hateful notes slipped under her door. Some called her a fraud. Others told her to leave Clarence before she destroyed him completely. Each word carved deeper into her spirit. She wanted to be strong, but she wasn't made of stone. When Clarence saw her clutching those notes, her hands trembling, something inside him broke. He realized this wasn't just about protecting his love, It was about protecting the woman herself from a world determined to tear her apart. That night, at a dinner with his top executives, Clarence made a choice that stunned the room. In the middle of their accusations, he pushed his glass aside and stood. "You want me to cut ties with Valerie? You want me to pretend she means nothing? That's not going to happen. Fire me if you want. Strip me of everything. But understand this, she is not negotiable." The silence that followed was suffocating. Some stared in disbelief, others in fury. For the first time, Clarence openly defied the very empire he had built. When Valerie heard what he had done, her heart twisted with both awe and terror. Part of her wanted to throw her arms around him. Another part wanted to run, because this man was risking everything, and she wasn't sure she was worth it. As the world around them continued to turn against their bond, Clarence's resolve only deepened. He no longer cared about the empire. All he cared about was proving to Valerie that she wasn't a passing obsession, but the woman he loved. And so he began planning a move so bold, so irreversible, that it would silence the world forever, or destroy them both in the process. The night of the charity gala arrived, one of the biggest events on Clarence's calendar. His company's board, investors, and the press were all present. It was supposed to be a showcase of wealth and power, but whispers filled the air long before Clarence took the stage. Would he appear with the maid on his arm? Would he dare to flaunt her in front of everyone who thought she didn't belong? Or would he finally bow to the pressure and distance himself? Valerie almost didn't come. The thought of walking into a room full of people who despised her sent chills through her chest. But Clarence insisted, and when she saw the determination in his eyes, she reluctantly agreed. She walked into the ballroom by his side, her simple dress in stark contrast to the glittering gowns around her. Murmurs swept through the crowd. Some sneered. Some pitied. Cameras flashed like lightning. As the orchestra quieted, Clarence stepped onto the stage. His voice was steady, but every word carried a weight no one expected. "For years, I believed power was measured in profits, and loyalty was bought with money. Tonight, I want to correct that. The truth is, I was wrong." A hush fell. No one dared to move. Clarence looked directly at Valerie, then back at the sea of shocked faces. "The woman standing beside me is not a liability. She's not a mistake. She's the only person who ever had the courage to tell me no, and because of that, she's the only person who's ever made me feel human." Gasps echoed across the room. Board members exchanged furious glances. Investors shifted uncomfortably. "I know some of you think I'm destroying my legacy. Maybe you're right. Maybe I'll lose everything after tonight. But I'd rather lose an empire built on fear than lose the one person who taught me what it means to truly live." He paused, his next words poised to burn bridges he could never rebuild. "I love her. And from this moment forward, I choose her, over the company, over the board, over the fortune. Whatever comes, I will face it with Valerie by my side." The crowd erupted, half in applause, half in outrage. Cameras captured every second, broadcasting the scandal across the world. Valerie's eyes filled with tears, torn between awe and fear of the storm his declaration had unleashed. As Clarence stepped down from the stage, taking Valerie's trembling hand in his, he knew there was no turning back. But what neither of them knew was that this bold declaration was only the beginning. Forces already moving against them weren't finished, and the cost of Clarence's choice would come sooner, and far harsher, than either of them could have imagined. The storm that followed Clarence's declaration was unlike anything Valerie had ever seen. Investors threatened to pull out, board members called emergency meetings, and gossip columns spun wild stories about her. Some called her a gold digger, others a scandal. Yet Clarence stood firm, shielding her from the worst of it, even though she knew the blows were hitting him harder than anyone realized. A week later, Clarence took Valerie to a part of the city he rarely visited anymore. The streets were filled with kids playing barefoot, mothers selling fruit at makeshift stalls, and buildings so worn down they looked as though they could collapse with one heavy rain. Valerie frowned. "Why bring me here?" Clarence didn't answer right away. Instead, He led her to a crumbling warehouse, its windows boarded up, its paint long faded. Inside, a group of volunteers were busy cleaning, hauling debris, and setting up tables. On the far wall hung a massive banner, Future Community Center. "This was my father's dream," Clarence said quietly. "Before I became obsessed with numbers, before power consumed me, he wanted this place to exist. A place where kids could learn, where families could gather, where no one was judged for what they didn't have." Valerie's heart softened. She saw a man stripped of arrogance, a man who wasn't trying to impress her with money but searching for something that mattered. "Why now?" she asked. "Because I don't want my name to only stand for greed and wealth," Clarence admitted. His eyes, usually so sharp and unreadable, were vulnerable. "But I don't know how to make this real. You've lived closer to this world than I ever have. I need your advice. Not as someone I'm trying to win over, but as someone I trust." Valerie was stunned. Clarence, the billionaire CEO who once commanded boardrooms with iron certainty, was asking her for guidance. She walked slowly through the warehouse, imagining it filled with light, children laughing, families gathering. "If you're serious about this, it has to be more than a headline project," she said carefully. "It can't just carry your name, it has to carry dignity. No handouts, no charity for show. Real programs, real jobs, real education." Clarence nodded, listening intently. For the first time, he wasn't interrupting, wasn't trying to assert control. He was just listening. Valerie turned back to him. "If you want this place to matter, you have to start by listening to the people it's meant for. Not by dictating. Can you do that?" Clarence gave a small, almost boyish smile. "For you, I'll learn." The words weren't smooth or rehearsed. They sounded raw, uncertain, but genuine. And that was what shook Valerie most. He wasn't acting like a billionaire trying to conquer her heart. He was just a man, searching for redemption. As volunteers hammered away in the background, Clarence rolled up his sleeves and joined them. Valerie watched in silence as he lifted heavy beams, carried trash, and wiped sweat from his forehead. For once, there were no cameras, no reporters, no crowd to impress. Just Clarence, shoulder to shoulder with ordinary people, working for something beyond himself. It was then Valerie realized her heart was in dangerous territory. She had tried so hard to keep her walls up, to remind herself their worlds were too far apart. But seeing him here, humble, flawed, and sincere, she felt a flicker of something she could no longer deny. Later that evening, when the volunteers had left, Clarence walked her back to her apartment. He didn't try to hold her hand. He didn't even try to kiss her. Instead, he stopped at her door and said, "Thank you, for being the only one willing to tell me the truth. I don't deserve your patience, but I'll keep trying until I do." Valerie closed the door behind her, her chest heavy with emotions she couldn't name. For the first time, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, his love wasn't another performance. Maybe it was real. But the question lingered like a shadow. Would the world ever let them live it freely? The city woke to shocking headlines. Clarence Hartford, the billionaire CEO, had quietly sold his penthouse, the crown jewel of his empire. No interviews, no press conferences, no photographs of champagne corks popping in celebration. Just a sudden transaction that left the financial world reeling. Valerie only heard about it from a neighbor, who waved a newspaper in disbelief. "Your boss is losing his mind," the woman muttered. But Valerie felt a strange chill crawl over her skin. Clarence never made sudden moves without purpose. That evening, she returned to her modest apartment to find an envelope slipped under her door. Her name was written across it in his unmistakable handwriting, bold, neat, but with a tremor hidden in the strokes. With trembling fingers, she opened it. "Valerie, by the time you read this, I'll be gone from the penthouse. I sold it, not because I was forced to, but because I finally understand something I should have known all along. Walls of glass and steel don't make a man strong. They only keep him locked away." Her eyes stung as she read on. "You once told me respect is greater than power. I didn't believe you then, but I do now. You have given me lessons no mentor, no boardroom, no deal ever could. You taught me what dignity looks like. What humility feels like. What it means to stand eye to eye, not above or below. Valerie's throat tightened. Each word sounded nothing like the domineering man who once barked orders across marble halls. These weren't rehearsed declarations. They were confessions, laid bare. I know you may never see me as more than a mistake I made in your past. And I accept that. But I don't want my presence to haunt you, to feel like pressure. So I am leaving this letter to offer you something else, a choice. She paused, pressing the paper to her chest before continuing. I am opening a foundation for the community center. It will need a director, someone fearless, someone who understands struggle and refuses to bend under it. That someone is you. Not because I pity you, not because I'm trying to win you, but because you are the only person I trust to make this work. If you accept, it will be yours to shape entirely. I will step back. No conditions, no strings. Her breath caught as she read the final lines. Valerie, if my presence has been a storm in your life, then let this be my first calm act. If nothing else, remember this. The word you once used against me, no, was the word that saved me from myself. Whether you walk away from me forever, or walk with me into something new, know this truth. You changed my life more than any fortune ever could. Clarence. The paper slipped from her fingers as she sank into a chair. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, the room spinning with emotions she couldn't contain. This was no performance, no stunt for the cameras. Clarence had stripped himself of his wealth's armor and left her with something more terrifying than power, the burden of choice. For the first time, Valerie felt the scales tip in her favor. He wasn't chasing her anymore. He wasn't pulling her into his world with the weight of his empire. He was stepping back, handing her the pen to write the next chapter. But the very thought shook her. Was it real? Could a man so ruthless, so driven by control, truly surrender everything without expecting something in return? She pressed the letter to her lips, torn between disbelief and hope. Somewhere deep inside, her heart whispered an answer she wasn't ready to admit. The night stretched on, the letter glowing faintly under the lamp. Valerie read it again, until her eyes blurred with tears. By the final line, her hand trembled not with fear, but with the ache of possibility. Outside, the city roared with noise. But in her small apartment, silence pressed in heavy. All she could hear were the words echoing in her mind. No was the word that saved me. A single thought struck her then, sharp and unshakable. If Clarence truly meant what he wrote, this wasn't just the end of their story. It might be the beginning. Valerie sat at the small corner cafe long before the agreed time. The place was ordinary, worn wooden tables, the faint hiss of the espresso machine, and the sweet aroma of roasted beans that filled the air. It was the last place she ever expected to meet a man who once owned towers in his name. But maybe that was the point. Her fingers tapped against her cup of tea as her mind wrestled with questions. Would Clarence arrive as the arrogant CEO she had once known, armored in pride? Or would he walk through the door as the man who had bared his soul in that letter? The door opened with a soft chime, and there he was, no expensive suit, no shadow of security guards trailing him. Clarence Hartford, in a plain shirt and simple jacket, looked almost like any other man. But Valerie noticed something more startling than his modest clothes, the absence of command in his eyes. He wasn't here to control. He was here to listen. He stopped at her table, hesitated, then spoke gently. "May I?" She gave a small nod. "If you're here for business pitches, I'll leave." A smile tugged at his lips, faint but real. "No business. Just coffee. Just us." They sat across from each other, and for the first time, silence wasn't a weapon between them. It was a pause filled with curiosity. Clarence ordered nothing more than black coffee, and Valerie couldn't help but notice how strange it felt to see a billionaire drinking from a chipped cafe mug like everyone else. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Clarence admitted, his voice lower now, almost uncertain. Valerie met his eyes steadily. "I wasn't sure either. But your letter, it felt different. Honest. He leaned forward, hands clasped as if steadying himself. It was. I meant every word. This isn't about me winning you. It's about showing you that I heard you finally. Her lips curved, not into a smile yet, but something softer than before. You've heard me before. You just didn't like what I said. That earned a small laugh from him, the kind that surprised even himself. True. You bruised my ego harder than anyone else ever has. This time Valerie smiled, just a flicker, but enough to light the tension between them. Their laughter grew slowly, carefully, like a flame sheltered against the wind. They spoke for hours. Not about wealth, not about boardrooms or investments, but about childhood memories, about the meals they missed from home, about ordinary days they once thought meaningless but now longed for. Clarence spoke about his father's silence, his mother's absence, the loneliness of growing up surrounded by riches but starved of affection. Valerie told him about the struggles of her family, the nights she worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on, the strength it took to say no when yes might have made her life easier but emptier. With every story shared, the air between them softened. The barriers that once defined their worlds began to thin, not because one surrendered to the other, but because they were finally standing on equal ground. Clarence looked at her across the table, not as the maid who rejected him, but as the woman who challenged him, who changed him. You know, he said softly, this is the happiest I've felt in years. No contracts, no cameras, just this. Valerie tilted her head, studying him. You're different here. Almost human. He chuckled, shaking his head. That's the nicest insult I've ever received. For the first time, she laughed without restraint, the sound pulling an answering smile from him. Something shifted in that moment, not grand, not explosive, but undeniably real. It wasn't money, it wasn't power. It was warmth. By the time the cups were empty, the cafe lights dimming for closing, neither of them wanted to leave. But Valerie stood first, tucking her chair in neatly. This doesn't mean I've decided anything, she said carefully, though her eyes betrayed a softness she hadn't allowed before. I know, Clarence replied. But it means something. At least to me. She hesitated at the door, her hand on the frame, then glanced back at him. Clarence. Yes. Her lips parted as though to say something more, but she stopped herself, offering only a quiet smile before stepping out into the night. Clarence remained seated long after she left, staring at the empty cup she had touched. For once, there was no impatience, no need to rush results. This wasn't conquest. This was the fragile beginning of something worth waiting for. But deep inside him, a new fear began to stir, not of losing her, but of whether the world outside this little cafe would allow them this fragile peace. Valerie stood outside the cafe a week later, her heart uncertain. She had promised herself she wouldn't get swept up by charm or grand gestures. But what Clarence had shown her wasn't grandeur, it was humility. For a man who once thought money could buy anything, learning to stand still, to wait, and to simply respect her choices was more powerful than all his riches combined. When she saw him again, there was no arrogance in his posture, no silent demand in his eyes. Just patience. He greeted her with a nod, not a claim, and for Valerie, that spoke louder than any bouquet or diamond ever could. Why me? She asked at last, her voice quiet but firm. You could have anyone. Women who would line up for your attention. Why keep chasing someone who keeps saying no? Clarence took a breath, steadying himself before answering. Because your no was the only word that ever mattered. It stopped me. It made me look at myself and realize I wasn't living. I was buying, performing, controlling, but never living. You made me see the difference. His confession stunned her, not because of its romance, but because of its honesty. She had always thought men like him couldn't bend, couldn't admit weakness. But here he was, stripped of everything except sincerity. Clarence, she whispered, her tone caught between doubt and hope. Words are easy. What happens when the world comes crashing in? When people point and whisper that a maid doesn't belong beside a CEO? He stepped closer, his voice steady but warm. Then let them whisper. Because for once, I'm not living for the world. I'm living for me, and maybe if you'll allow it for us. The courage in his voice struck something deep in her chest. Valerie had fought her whole life to be seen beyond her station, beyond her uniform. Now, someone was willing to risk his empire just to prove she was worth more than titles or wealth. Still, the doubts lingered. Could their bond survive under judgment? Could dignity and love coexist in a world that thrived on hierarchy? Clarence seemed to read her silence. He reached into his pocket, pulling out nothing more than a small folded piece of paper. No jewelry, no contracts. Just words. I wrote this down, he said softly, offering it to her. Because if I tried to speak it without thinking, I'd fail. Read it when you're ready. Valerie unfolded the note. His handwriting was sharp but shaky, every word pressed with weight. Love isn't ownership. Love isn't conquest. It's respect. If I have to spend the rest of my life proving that to you, I will. But even if you never choose me, know this, you already changed me. And for that, I'll always be grateful. Her throat tightened as the words sank in. This wasn't a proposal, wasn't a plea. It was freedom. Freedom for her to choose without fear. When she finally looked up, Clarence wasn't watching her with expectation. He was waiting, open, vulnerable,